Nancy Jones, an elderly woman of 81 years old, had to leave the cabin where she lived for most of her life because her greedy nephew put her in an asylum to live out her last years. Nancy was a sweet woman, so she ended up accepting it. But first, she wanted to fulfill one last wish. She wanted to leave the cabin to a kind waiter who served her for a long time and was one of the only people who were by her side in that small town. However, her selfish nephew stopped her, but when the young waiter entered the cabin, he found something inside that changed his life completely. Since her husband's death, Nancy has lived alone in her cozy cabin in the small town of Jasper, Canada. She had always been able to take good care of herself and her husband when he was alive, although, with her advanced age, Nancy realized that she needed to slow down her pace a little. She still tried to keep the house clean and her plants well cared for, but her disposition no longer followed her wishes. One day, Nancy was finishing preparing breakfast when suddenly the phone rang. On the other side, she heard her nephew's voice, who didn't even say hello and started addressing the same subject as usual. "Aunt Nancy, you need to go to a nursing home soon. There are people there to take care of you and give you everything you need." The young man sometimes managed to use a respectful tone of voice, usually when it involved some self-interest. He also argued that the elderly woman would have several activities and could make new friends to interact and not be so alone anymore. Finally, after hearing all the arguments one more time, Nancy accepted. After all, she knew that Ryan would insist until she said yes. Nancy and her husband had no children, and the rest of the family was scattered all over the country, so Ryan was the only family reference Nancy had, and despite visiting her rarely, he always kept in touch to make sure she was going to live in a nursing home. The old woman agreed, but wanted to know what Ryan intended to do with the cabin and the small plot of land around it, which contained a beautiful garden that her late husband created years ago and which she lovingly conserved. Her plans were like an extension of her husband, and Nancy spent a good deal of her time in that garden. Her nephew suggested that she sell the cabin and keep all the money. "You can sell it and keep the money, but if you want to give me a commission, I won't refuse," he said, forcing a laugh. Despite everything, Nancy felt prepared to go to the asylum, but she had only one last wish: that the cabin be handed over as an inheritance to Edward, the kind waiter from her favorite coffee shop. Edward was a single father. He lived simply with his only son, close to where he worked, and Nancy met him 10 years ago when he was only 20 years old. The young man moved to their remote town in search of a new life, but ended up encountering difficult obstacles along the way. Sadly, he lost his wife, mother of his son, when she fell out of a canyon on a trail in Jasper National Park and couldn't resist. Shortly after his wife's death, Edward fell into a depression and ended up losing his job as manager of a ski shop, using their savings to support their son and home while he recovered. When he was finally able to get back on his feet, he got a job as a waiter at a local coffee shop, where he met Nancy. Edward always proved to be a kind and hard-working man, but over the years, Nancy could see how really loyal the young man was. He had always been helpful to everyone, but he and Nancy had a special relationship, as if they were mother and son, since the first day they met. Both ended up taking in each other because of the loss of their partners, and they met regularly when the elderly woman appeared with a piece of homemade cake for Edward and ordered a cup of coffee that always got cold while they talked. Once, Nancy lost her balance at home and sprained her ankle, making it impossible for her to do some activities for a few days. The only person she knew would help her without thinking twice was Edward, because she knew that her nephew would complain or even leave her without the necessary help. When he found out about her injury, Edward bought Miss Nancy everything she needed and helped her around the house as much as he could while he wasn't working or looking after his son. This was one of the many times that Edward was by her side. However, When the elderly woman told her nephew that she wanted to leave the cabin to Edward, Ryan showed his displeasure without any shame, saying that Edward was certainly a gold digger. To reassure the aunt, Ryan said he would do his best to accommodate her request, but that he couldn't guarantee anything. What Ryan and Edward didn't realize was that Nancy had left something much more valuable inside the cabin. During the period when Edward lost his wife and job, his savings were able to support him and his son for some time. However, before he got a new job, all the money he saved ran out and he got into some debt, which included a debt to pay the rent on the house he lived in. He and his son were evicted and had to move to an even more precarious residence than the previous one, and despite being simpler, the rent and bills were still difficult to pay with a waiter's salary. The meeting with Nancy in the coffee shop eased not only the pain and loneliness of young Edward, but also became a friendship that would completely change the course of his life. Everything that Edward did for the old woman was from the heart, and sometimes when he went to her house to help her, he would take his son. The boy was also enchanted by Nancy and loved listening to her childhood stories, as well as playing and running around the beautiful garden. The woman was filled with love whenever they came to her house for a visit, or when she went to the coffee shop. They were the only two people who seemed to genuinely care about her. Sometimes Miss Nancy insisted that Edward accept some payment for everything he did, but he always politely refused and never let her pay him a penny, saying that her company was all he needed. Over the years, the relationship of those two lonely people became like that of mother and son, and Nancy was like a mentor to Edward, who listened carefully to all of her life advice. The young waiter's depression eased, and both discovered new ways of happiness, building a relationship of loyalty that few are lucky enough to find. It was a true friendship. Shortly after telling Edward about her nephew's decision, Nancy left for the nursing home, with no time to say goodbye to the cabin she and her husband had built with so much love. Her nephew Ryan organized all the paperwork quickly, without consulting his aunt, and there was nothing Edward could do but comfort his friend. The moving was so sudden that when Edward went to visit Nancy, she was already gone. When Edward arrived and saw the door ajar, Ryan was finishing packing some things into some boxes. Edward tried to introduce himself to find out exactly which asylum Nancy was in, but he couldn't even say his name. As soon as Ryan saw him, he threw him out. "What are you doing here? I know very well who you are. You are nothing but a gold digger. Go away. No one else will support your family or your addictions. There is nothing here for you." Edward certainly didn't expect that kind of rudeness. When he tried to talk, he was practically kicked out of the property after being ignored, and Ryan slamming the door in his face, threatening to call the police. Edward was disgusted by Ryan's attitude, but he tried his best not to be shaken by that situation, and decided that he would find out on his own which asylum Nancy was in. The next morning, Edward left his son at the community daycare where he studied, and learned that there were only 3 nursing homes in the city. After visiting the first 2 and not finding his friend, he became frustrated and his hopes were fading. Did Ryan take her to another city? Edward wondered. He knew Ryan's nature and character from all the stories Nancy had told and his own experience, so he was prepared for everything. After crossing town and taking a road that led to the last nursing home, Edward finally arrived and asked the receptionist in a light-hearted tone if Nancy Jones could have visitors. The young woman said yes, but only from her family, to which Edward promptly replied, "Perfect, I'm her nephew." "Oh, yes. I was finding it strange to hear your voice only over the phone this few weeks. Your aunt will be very happy. I think she needs some company," said the receptionist. That made it clear that after the hospitalization, Ryan never looked for his aunt again. Edward quickly went to his friend's room to enjoy the little time they would have, since he would have to pick up his son from the daycare in a few hours. But when he opened the door, he was shocked by what he saw. His old friend was lying on the bed with her head down, looking sick and fragile, like he had never seen her before. But when she saw Edward, Nancy's expression changed and her eyes lit up. With his help, she sat up and asked how he and his son were doing. Edward tried to avoid saying negative things about his life, so as not to worry the elderly woman even more, but after she insisted, he ended up saying that the amount of expenses had increased, and he just discovered his son had a treatable health problem, but the medications were too expensive and he couldn't pay for them. From that, Nancy stared at Edward for a few seconds and sighed, as if she was making a decision. She gathered strength and managed to whisper in his ear what she wanted to say for some time. When he heard what she said, his expression of concern changed to surprise. "You gotta be kidding me, Nancy. What do you mean?" said Edward, totally shocked. Nancy laughed lightly, looking very happy to finally get it off her chest. The elderly woman held her friend's hand and said, "You are like my son. It would make me very happy if you accepted it. You would no longer have to pay rent, and you could take care of your boy with more peace of mind, so that he gets well and healthy soon. Please accept it." The nurse knocked on the door and said visiting hours were over. "Well, I have to go, but I'll be back tomorrow. Don't you think you're going to get rid of me that easily?" said Edward, hugging Nancy and saying goodbye, but making sure to leave his phone number at reception in case they needed to get in touch. Edward left the asylum with a smile on his face, not imagining that those would be the last words he would say to her. The next morning, Edward was finishing making breakfast to take his son to the daycare and head to the nursing home, but he was interrupted by the ringing of the phone. It was the nurse from the asylum, and the man couldn't believe what she told him. Nancy had died that night, apparently from natural causes and without suffering, but that news shook the waiter, who now would no longer have his friend by his side after so many years. Taken by mixed feelings, Edward left his son at school and headed towards Nancy's cabin. Despite the elderly woman's desire that he keep the residence, he knew that there would be an objection from Ryan, and he didn't know how to deal with it. But he remembered what the elderly woman whispered to him in the asylum and went there confidently. He opened the door with the spare key Nancy kept under the rug and sat down on the couch in the living room, one of the few pieces of furniture left in the cabin. Edward looked around and remembered Nancy playing with his son like a loving grandmother, remembering her cooking delicious food in the cozy kitchen and the conversations that soothed his heart. As he daydreamed, Edward thought again of the words spoken by Nancy the day before. He headed towards her room and pushed the bed to the side, finding a small trap door in the floor, just like she said. Curious, he opened the trap door and his jaw dropped when he saw a pendant with a large, glittering emerald stone surrounded by diamonds. That's when he remembered one of the stories that Nancy told him about a precious jewel that her husband had given her a long time ago that carried a sentimental value much greater than the material one. Edward shook with nervousness, not knowing whether to put the pendant away or run home with it. He thought for a few moments and decided to take the object with him, as Nancy had insisted that it was her last wish to leave the cabin and everything inside to him. So he went home, and the next day he decided with a clear conscience to move in with his son as soon as possible. When Edward and the boy were finishing cleaning the house, Ryan appeared in surprise and found the door ajar. "What the hell is going on here? What are you thinking? That you will live here? You think my aunt would leave this cabin to a stranger and a brat?" roared the nephew, calling the police right away. The cops arrived and heard both sides of the story, but they said that Edward couldn't stay there without having a will or something to prove that the house was indeed his. They ended by politely saying that Edward would need to leave immediately, and so he did. Ryan laughed and teased while Edward and his son collected their belongings, but the nephew would regret it shortly afterwards. After a week, the cabin was put up for sale, and an unknown woman called Ryan, making an offer he couldn't refuse, which got him pretty excited. They arranged to meet in front of the residence. The woman introduced herself, saying she was a lawyer, and opened a briefcase full of money, handing the documents for Ryan to sign and finalize the sale. As soon as he signed, the stranger said, "Well, thanks for everything, but you'd better meet the real owner of the cabin. I'm here as a lawyer just to make sure everything was legal." She pointed to a car parked in the street in front of the house, which Edward got out of, wearing a nice suit. "You can hand over the keys to Edward. He's the new owner of the cabin," reinforced the lawyer, while Ryan simply couldn't move or utter a word because of the shock. So Edward took the opportunity to say what he wanted to have said a long time ago. "You never cared about your aunt's true wishes, only when it was in your interest. It was your fault that she died alone in that asylum, and I feel sorry for you for not having made a point of knowing the wonderful person that she was. We have nothing more to talk about. I just hope that someday you realize how much you lose being such a petty and individualistic person." Then he slammed the door in Ryan's face, returning the gesture from a week ago. He was determined to respect and care for the cabin and the garden that Nancy and her husband had built, and which would now be a warm house for him and his son. Edward lit a candle next to a photo of Nancy, and that night he had a peaceful night of sleep, like he hadn't had in years, feeling welcomed and happy for having managed to fulfill his dear friend's last wishes. If you know any similar stories, write about it in the comments. Like the video, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more fantastic stories.